This is number 44 in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre is one of those famous events that all Americans have heard about, but few probably know the actual details. In fact, factual details about the event are difficult to discern because the many witnesses who witnessed the event gave statements about it that were strongly in favor of one side or the other, so there's a lot of bias probably obscuring what the facts and details really were. As you watch and listen to this video, try and answer this question. Do you think that the colonists were justified in their actions? Keep in mind that English constitutional law had two competing and I think incompatible traditions. The older tradition emphasized the sacred reverence for the sovereignty of the crown and its government and emphasized stability at nearly any cost. The newer constitutional tradition emphasized the inalienable rights of individual people, the duty of the government to protect those rights, and the right of the people to change the government if their inalienable rights were not being protected. In a previous podcast that I did called The Glorious Revolution of 1689, which is podcast number 21 in this series, I go into some detail about those two constitutional traditions, where they came from, and what they portended for England's North American colonies. If you've been listening to the last few videos in this series, you can see how resistant the colonies had become and how clearly they had favored the second of these two traditions. Some of the people who lived through the Boston Massacre actually considered it to be the sparking point for the movement for independence of the colonies. In fact, John Adams, in a letter written many years later, wrote, "On that night, the foundation of American independence was laid." Before we get started, I thought it would be a good idea to look at a map of Boston, and I've placed on this map several of the important points that pertain to the Boston Massacre, just to give you an idea of what was happening. On the left side of this map, you can see out in the water a red dot with the word Cheers next to it. For those of you old enough to remember, Cheers was a famous TV sitcom that was popular back in the 1980s, and it centered in a tavern that was in Boston called Cheers. They hadn't filled in enough of the water or expanded the town physically yet, and so if Cheers existed back in colonial times, it would have actually been out in the water. Of course, today it's a little ways from the water. So moving to the right a little ways from the Cheers Tavern, you can see where John Hancock's house is. That's where his mansion was. Today the state legislature and the state government of Massachusetts has its offices there. A little ways to the right from the Hancock mansion is the courthouse and jail. And a little further to the right from there is the townhouse, or the old state house. That's where the legislature met back in colonial times and where the state or colonial government offices were. A little to the right of the townhouse, just a little, is the customs house. And you can see I've put a red explosion there right in front of it. That's where the Boston Massacre, or the event called the Boston Massacre, actually occurred. Just a little north of the customs house is the Faneuil Hall. Faneuil Hall is still there today, just like the townhouse. It's one of the few buildings from colonial times that's still there. It's important because the people that were killed during the Boston Massacre, that's where their funerals were held. South of the townhouse is the Province House. This was the official residence of the governor. And if you go just a little right from the Province House, you can see Gray's Rope Walks. This is kind of where we have to start our narrative, or probably the best place to start the narrative of the Boston Massacre events, because this preceded it and kept the town in tension. There was a brawl at Gray's Rope Walk between soldiers and rope makers that kind of starts the spiral down into what becomes the Boston Massacre. So in a few minutes we'll go through that. That's probably a good place to start. When we left off for my last podcast, you'll remember the British government had decided to place troops in Boston to enforce its authority and to protect royal officials. Benjamin Franklin, who was an agent for many of the colonies at that time, was in London when this happened, and someone asked him if when the troops arrived, if they would find a rebellion there in Boston, because everyone had seen what had happened in Boston, the rioting and the abuse of the customs officials, and etc. Ben Franklin replied with his usual wit that the troops would not find a rebellion there, but he also said they may indeed make one, which is pretty much what happened. The tension in Boston was indeed very great, and in fact, General Gage, who was in overall command of the British troops in North America, made the comment, "I live in hourly dread of disturbance." Bostonians generally greatly resented having troops in their town. They saw it as an occupying force. John Adams made the comment that it was during this time of occupation and tumult that his relative Samuel Adams made the determination to gain independence from Great Britain. That's when he got his ideas that they needed to be independent. And as we'll see going forward, Samuel Adams, from this point forward, plays a critical role in the movement for independence and in the events leading up to independence. So with all this in mind, we now return to Gray's rope walk. On March 2nd, a soldier named Thomas Walker came to the rope walk. He was looking for employment. Soldiers were so poorly paid that often they did odd jobs on the side when they had time to themselves. One of the rope makers, William Green, told him, "Yeah, you can clean my outhouse," and I'm using much nicer terms than Green did. And of course, this led to a fight where Green and Walker then started fighting, and several other rope makers joined in, and Walker was beaten up, and he left and went back to the barracks, where he recruited some of his friends, other soldiers, and a group of them came back to the rope walk, and a new brawl started all over again. On the screen right now is a picture of what a rope walk looked like. There were several of them in Boston. You can see it looked like a long brown shed. In these sheds, rope makers would weave hemp into long lengths of rope and then coat them with tar to make them weatherproof for service in the Navy or in shipping. The rope makers were seen as kind of a rowdy bunch, and they had a lot of weapons at their disposal to use during riots. They had large sticks that could double as clubs that they used to wind the rope, and they also had a lot of tar handy, which was great for tarring and feathering people. So on the next day, March 3rd, a bigger group of soldiers came to the rope walk and engaged in another brawl with the rope makers, and a lot of people were injured. There were clubs being used, even sabers were being used. So there were people that were cut and people that were bruised up pretty badly. So 2 days later, after the last of these rope walk brawls, you can say that Boston was very tense. And there are stories of soldiers wandering around looking for fights with citizens and beating up people in back alleys. There are also reports of Bostonians walking around with clubs looking for fights with British soldiers. So it was a very tense situation. Governor Bernard, who was such a big actor in my last podcast, had been recalled. He was back in England now. And the person now in charge of this big mess was Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. He was acting governor. There's a picture of him up there on the screen. Now, before we actually talk about the Boston Massacre, the events of that evening on March 5th, it's important to emphasize that it's very difficult to find out exactly what happened. Reports of the incident often had a political taint, and the many people who were deposed and questioned by justices of the peace to give statements to the court proceedings often had their own biases too. So in recounting the events of the Boston Massacre, I'm going to rely on the general outlines, the broad brushstrokes that are painted by many of the witnesses, and many of the details will just have to be determined by each listener. So I want to kind of set the scene for how the massacre occurred. It occurred between 9 and 10 p.m., the moon was bright, and there was about a foot or so of snow on the ground. The problem seems to have started when a British officer, Captain Goldfinch, went to a local barber to have his hair dressed. The barber, who was a patriot, apparently didn't want to dress this officer's hair, so he had his apprentice do it instead, which offended the British officer. After the young apprentice, a young man named Edward Garrick, rendered services, the British officer, Captain Goldfinch, apparently left without paying, and he was walking down the street. On the screen now you can see a little diagram that I drew, or a map, showing what happened. This map is based on one drawn by Paul Revere. The buildings are shown in black, and the pale red lines show the edges of Boston's streets as they are today. The officer was walking past the customs house where the customs board was headquartered, and there was a lone British sentry, a Private Hugh White, out front in front of his guard box there. Private White saw this young man, the apprentice, harassing the captain, demanding payment, and Hugh White stepped in and apparently, according to some accounts, chastised the boy or the young apprentice, even hitting him with the butt of his musket, depending on which account you listen to, told the young man to go away, that this officer was a gentleman, and that this apprentice had no business harassing him. So while all this is happening, a crowd starts to gather, and they start to taunt Private White. He's a lone sentry on duty in his guard box out there, and he starts to fear for his safety as the crowd becomes more aggressive. So he goes over to the steps of the customs house, pounds on the door to see if he can get in for his safety, and no one answers. So he then begins yelling out for help, and Captain Preston, who's in the nearby barracks, grabs some soldiers, and they come out to support this lone sentry who was on sentry duty. As you can see from the diagram on the screen, Captain Preston and his soldiers were formed into kind of a semicircle, which would kind of protect their flanks and give them some protection from this growing mob. At this point in the evening, or thereabouts, someone began ringing the church bells. The ringing of church bells was usually a signal to the townspeople that there was a fire or some other emergency and that they needed to come out and help. So a lot of people started to spill out into the streets, and some of them mentioned meeting up at the town well, which you can see on the map there at the top left corner of the map, just above the townhouse in the street. And then from here they could go to where the crowd was congregating near the customs house where the massacre occurred. According to many reports, the mob started throwing chunks of ice, icicles, snowballs, and even oyster shells and whatever else they could find at the soldiers. In addition, some people were screaming at them, "Fire, fire at us." They were taunting them, asking them to fire into the crowd, which kind of seems irresponsible if that was true. According to some other accounts, some of the mob that were getting close to the soldiers were being poked at by the soldiers' bayonets. In the diagram, you can see the mob or crowd being represented by the blue dots. According to some accounts, a large stick was thrown, hitting one of the soldiers and knocking him to the ground. And shortly thereafter, a shot was fired into the crowd, followed after a time by a few more shots into the crowd too. Apparently, the first person struck and killed was a man named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was described as a mulatto. He was probably of mixed African and American Indian descent. His last name, Attucks, seems to indicate that he was part American Indian. As a youth, he was a slave, but apparently ran away and joined the crew of a ship and was out to sea much of the time. Two other people that were hit and killed at the scene were Samuel Gray and James Caldwell. Samuel Maverick was hit, but he died a few hours later. Patrick Carr, who was also hit by musket fire, lingered for about a week painfully and then finally died about a week later after being hit. Hearing all this gunfire, Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson ran from his mansion in the North End down to the scene of the crime, which was either brave or foolhardy, I'm not sure which. He could have been torn apart by the crowd who hated him, but he did go up onto the balcony of the townhouse and talk to the people and told them to disperse, go home. After some effort, they were able to go home, promised them he would look into the matter and that he would bring any offenders to justice. And while all this was going on, Dr. Joseph Warren was attending to those who were wounded. There were a number of people wounded by the shooting that recovered later on. The red circle just to the left of center in the diagram indicates where the city of Boston has placed a memorial marker showing where the Boston Massacre occurred. As you can see, though, from the diagram, it's not in the spot where it occurred, but it wouldn't make sense to put the marker out where it really occurred, because if they did, it would be right out in the middle of a busy intersection, as you can see from the pale red lines indicating where the modern streets are in Boston. So later in the evening, as things settled down, Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson talked to Captain Preston, and Captain Preston and the soldiers that accompanied him out were arrested and thrown in the jail. The names of the soldiers that were arrested along with Captain Preston were Hugh Montgomery, James Hartigan, William McCauley, Hugh White, William Wems, John Carroll, Matthew Kilroy, and William Warren. On the screen right now is a diagram or map of the event drawn by Paul Revere. I relied on it heavily when I drew my own diagrams because I felt it was probably a good recreation of the scene. If you look at the top of the map, just to the right of center, you can see the soldiers formed near the guard box in kind of a semicircular formation. Now, just in front of the soldiers, you can see a pile of dead people, and a few inches below that, you can see more that are dead, and one even below that down in the alleyway, crawling away. The little letters that are put around the map that Revere put in there, I'm not sure what those mean. They may indicate where people were at during different phases of this whole incident, but I'm not sure. On the screen right now is a really famous engraving that Paul Revere did of the Boston Massacre, and it appeared in the next edition of the Boston Gazette, and it's titled "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street." The engraving is not exactly accurate. It was intended to be propagandic in nature. If you look carefully at the King's soldiers there, they all seem to have a little smirk on their face, and you can see Captain Preston behind them with the sword as though he's commanding them to fire into the crowd, which he said he did not do. And I don't believe there's any good evidence that Captain Preston ordered his men to fire into the crowd. Notice, too, that the customs headquarters there is labeled Butcher's Hall. I think you could make a case that the customs commissioners were probably the only group in the city that were hated more than the soldiers. And if you look really carefully at the tip of Captain Preston's sword, right at the top of the sword tip, you can see what looks like a musket barrel firing out of a window into the crowd too, which then was designed to implicate that the customs officers were also part of this firing into the crowd, killing innocent people. Some of the witnesses did say that they saw gunfire coming from the windows of the customs house. In the center of this engraving is the old townhouse or the old state house, and right in the center of it you can see that balcony. That's where Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson stood and talked to the crowd, convincing them to go home, that he would make sure justice was done, etc. A lot of famous people have stood at that balcony. In my last podcast, I spoke about that, and I showed a picture from the newspaper from 1976 of Queen Elizabeth II standing at that same balcony addressing the crowd in Boston when she was visiting for our nation's bicentennial celebration. So that balcony has seen a lot of famous people and a lot of important events. Notice, too, that the crowd is simply standing there. None of them are shown as having clubs or cudgels or any other weapons. They're just kind of innocently minding their business and being fired to as they're questioning what's happening. It's also important to notice that this engraving was borrowed by Revere. He didn't actually do this. He used someone else's work and then changed it for his own purposes. Originally, this engraving was done by a man named Henry Pelham, who was a friend of Paul Revere's and had lent Paul Revere the printing. And he complained Paul Revere had done this without attributing any of it to him. He said, "I had entrusted it into the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you." The morning after the massacre, there was a town meeting at Faneuil Hall, and Samuel Adams was one of the speakers. He used a lot of colorful language to describe what had happened. He called it the bloody work in King Street, and he used terms like blood and carnage. And he and the town meeting were strongly of the opinion that the troops needed to be removed from Boston. In fact, the town meeting appointed Samuel Adams and John Hancock as a committee to go talk to the governor, or acting Governor Hutchinson, to demand the removal of the troops. So Samuel Adams and John Hancock head over to the State House and end up having a meeting with Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson and Colonel Dalrymple and some of the other high-ranking Massachusetts officials. Now, there was actually more than one meeting throughout the day between them, but just for simplification, I'll condense this down into one simple dialogue. Adams told the British officials that the only way to bring peace to the town and guarantee safety was to remove the troops. Hutchinson mentioned that he did not have authority to remove the troops. Samuel Adams then reminded Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson that the colonial charter made the governor or acting governor the commander-in-chief of all British forces within the colony and said that he had authority to go ahead and remove the troops. During this discussion, Adams also reminded the assembled British officials that the neighboring towns' militias were assembling and that it could be more than 10,000 men eventually descending on Boston if something wasn't done to prevent more violence. And apparently Hutchinson reminded Samuel Adams, or asked him if he remembered the definition of treason, as though somehow this was a treasonous act. After some discussion among themselves, it was recommended that they remove one of the regiments from town, which they agreed to do, and they told Samuel Adams and John Hancock this. Adams then reminded Hutchinson that if he had authority to remove one regiment, he had authority to remove the other as well. In the end, it was agreed that the troops would be removed from Boston, which was a huge victory for the town. It's interesting that the town of Boston is basically running the colony now because Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's authority, even though he's the acting governor, can't anymore command the militia of the colony. They're now against him. And other than these few regiments in the city of Boston, he has no troops to enforce his authority. It was a huge victory for the people, or especially the patriots of Boston, who celebrated this in high style. And it was hugely humiliating to Hutchinson. In a letter to Lord Hillsborough, Hutchinson wrote, "Our people are as infatuated as they were in the times of the witchcraft. I have only the shadow of power. The authority of government is gone in all matters wherein the controversy between the kingdom and the colonies is concerned." So by the end of March, all of the British troops had been removed from Boston, and Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson actually sent a letter to London asking that he be replaced. Ironically, Hutchinson's letter didn't arrive in time, and so Lord Hillsborough had sent a letter to Hutchinson making him the governor of Massachusetts, kind of a promotion. Those letters must have crossed in the ocean somewhere. I'm sure that when the official commission arrived making Hutchinson the official governor of Massachusetts, Hutchinson probably was not happy about it. I can't imagine how difficult it would be under these conditions to have literally no power to enforce your commands, and here you are governing one of the biggest colonies in North America. It really was an impossible situation. I imagine he lost a lot of sleep over this. He probably worried that someday when he got home, would the king question him about what had happened? He probably felt the frustration of being in charge of it and not having the ability to actually do anything with it. He had no troops, he had no power, nothing. He couldn't even command the militia anymore. Immediately after the Boston Massacre occurred, the war for public opinion began. I want to read some excerpts from the next issue of the Boston Gazette that came out right after the massacre. The town of Boston affords a recent and melancholy dramatization of the destructive consequences of quartering troops among citizens in a time of peace under a pretense of supporting the laws and aiding civil authority. The article then goes on to give gruesome details about the people that were dead or wounded from the Boston Massacre, and then it says the people were immediately alarmed with the report of this horrid massacre. The bells were set ringing, and great numbers soon assembled in the place where the tragical scene had been acted. Their feelings may be better conceived than expressed, and while some were taking care of the dead and the wounded, the rest were in consultation about what to do in these dreadful circumstances. Then it goes on to say, Tuesday morning presented a most shocking scene, the blood of our fellow citizens running like water through King Street and the Merchants' Exchange, the principal spot of the military parade for about 18 months past. Our blood might also be tracked up to the head of Long Lane and through diverse other streets and passages. Notice the use of the word massacre. The Patriots would very effectively attach that word to these events. They didn't call it a riot that had unfortunate circumstances. They're calling it a massacre, which conjures up very frightening images, which is what it was intended to do. The town also sent justices of the peace to collect statements from people who had witnessed these events. And of course, these were statements by people that were sympathetic towards the Patriot cause for the most part. And from these statements, they published what became a pamphlet called A Short Narrative. And this short narrative detailed everything that you would expect it to, and in the way you would expect it to, showing that the British soldiers were there to cause trouble, that they wanted trouble, and that this was very oppressive to have them in the town, and that all the Bostonians were just simple victims of an oppressive situation. And a short time later, they also published another pamphlet called Additional Observations that went further into detail. And interestingly, in this publication, they're actually hinting at independence now. British authorities, for their part, were doing the same thing. They were collecting statements from witnesses sympathetic to their side, of course, and they published a pamphlet called A Fair Account, which was designed to counter everything the Patriots were saying. Unfortunately, the Patriots had done a better job at getting their accounts overseas first, and so their accounts reached London first, excerpts of which were published in publications in London. They also sent letters to Ben Franklin encouraging him to try and get a jump on this by giving their account first to British officials and to spread it around as much as possible, because Franklin was one of the representatives in London of some of the colonies at that time. He had a lot of connections. Franklin was in kind of a precarious situation. British authorities didn't really trust him, but the Sons of Liberty didn't trust him either. So Franklin wrote a letter, and with his permission, a publication called the Gentleman's Quarterly, which was one of the most widely distributed publications in London, printed this letter. And in it, Franklin said, being born and bred in one of the countries, and having lived long and made many agreeable connections of friendship in the other, I wish all prosperity to both. I do not find that I have gained any point in either country except that of rendering myself suspected by my impartiality, in England of being too much of an American, and in America of being too much of an Englishman. Overall, the colonists almost always did a better job winning the propaganda war. They were quicker about it. They got their side of the story sent off to London quicker, so it was published, and in this way they captured the narrative quicker, using the words they wanted to use to describe it, like massacre in this case. This was also important in building colonial unity because these publications and newspaper articles were often published in newspapers throughout the colonies, or republished, I should say. As soon as the smoke cleared from the firing of the Boston Massacre, the wheels of justice began slowly creaking. I mentioned that Preston and his men were arrested later on that evening and thrown into the jail. Aside from the constitutional, political, legal issues, you have to remember how difficult this situation would have been for Captain Preston and his men. All their fellow soldiers had been removed from Boston, so there's not the slightest shred of protection for them if a mob decided to descend on the jail and to drag them out and maybe hang them at the Liberty Tree. They were arrested early on the morning of March 6th, and they were housed in that jail till their trials, which did not begin until October. And if a mob didn't get them, there was every chance they might be convicted of what they were accused of, which was, I'm sure in their minds, frustrating and infuriating since they were just doing their jobs as soldiers. It's probably the way they saw it. To me, it seems that the British government was showing a callous disregard for the welfare of these soldiers. I recognize that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was inflamed, all of New England was, but I think something could have been done to alleviate this situation. Maybe the king could have granted a full pardon to all of them, and even failing that, maybe some brute force could have been used to just get them out of the jail and say, hey, you know what, we're not doing this. This is political, knock it off, or something. But that might have required more troops. I've always said that I think the small number of troops, 2 regiments that the British sent to Boston, probably were just enough to irritate them, but not enough to frighten them. From his jail cell, Captain Preston sent a letter to William Pitt, a famous British politician. He was probably just hoping someone could help him somewhere, or maybe he could encourage the king to issue some pardons quickly. In part of the letter he wrote, I have nothing to support me under these difficulties but the testimony of a clear conscience, and such evidence as would easily equip me in any other place but this, where they are looking for anything that will be a palliative, an excuse for the rebellion, and rebellion it certainly is. I must rest there, having no hopes but from His Majesty's pardon, and God knows if it will come time enough to save me from a shameful end. So bitter and inveterate are many of the malcontents here, that they are industriously using every method to fish out evidence to prove it was a concerted scheme to murder the inhabitants. Others are infusing the utmost malice and revenge into the minds of the people, who are to be my jurors by false publications, votes of towns, and all other artifices, that so from a settled rancor against the officers and troops in general, the suddenness of my trial after the affair, while the people's minds are all greatly inflamed, I am though perfectly innocent under most unhappy circumstances, having in reason to expect but the loss of life in a very ignominious manner, without the interposition of His Majesty's royal goodness. And this must be the fate of all the unhappy soldiers confined with me. In short, with such jurors and witnesses, we have nothing better to expect than be sacrificed as a terror to all others who should oppose the people, however wrong. So it looks like Preston was just expecting that one way or the other he was going to be killed, because the jury pool was tainted and they wanted someone put to death for the Boston Massacre. On the screen right now is a picture of young John Adams, and it's interesting that months before the trials even occurred, John Adams was selected, and Samuel Adams, of course, had a big hand in this selection. John Adams was selected as one of the 2 attorneys to represent Captain Preston as well as the soldiers. Now, John Adams was an ardent patriot and relative of Samuel Adams, so why was he chosen for this? It's often thought that John Adams, being a patriot, would not steer his defense into questioning or probing or discovering things that might be embarrassing to the patriot cause, or especially to the Sons of Liberty. And so that having John Adams in that role was actually maybe a good defense mechanism and a way of keeping embarrassing things from being uncovered. A grand jury handed down indictments against Captain Preston and his soldiers pretty quickly after the smoke cleared. They said that Preston and his soldiers, quote, not having the fear of God before their eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil and their own wicked hearts, did on the 5th day of this instant march at Boston, aforesaid, within the county aforesaid, with force of arms feloniously, willfully, and of their malice aforethought, assault one Crispus Attucks, then and there being in the peace of God, and of the said Lord the King. Samuel Adams and the Patriot leaders wanted the trials to occur quickly, right after the Boston Massacre event happened, because they knew the public would be inflamed and angry and it would be a better chance of getting convictions. But Hutchinson was able to maneuver to delay things, and in fact their arraignments didn't actually occur till September. Hutchinson wanted the inhabitants of Boston to kind of calm down a little bit. The judges that would actually try the case were more or less Hutchinson's men. These were people close to him. None of them had formal legal education. In most of the colonies, legal practice was learned by kind of on-the-job apprentice-type work. I talked about this in some detail in a previous podcast I did about the colonial judiciaries. Ironically, Hutchinson himself, even though he was governor, he was also Chief Justice of the court, and he could have sat in these trials if he had wanted to. Wisely, he declined to get involved. He ended up being a witness, but had he got involved as a judge, I think it would have made things even worse. Captain Preston's trial occurred first. He was tried separately from the rest of the soldiers, and his trial began on October 24th and lasted till October 30th, which was at that time the longest trial in Massachusetts history. The people that were selected for jury duty at that time more or less favored acquittal, or they were people that would have favored acquittal. So in this case, Preston had both the judges and the jury somewhat in his favor. The judge gave somewhat lengthy jury instructions to the jury, but I want to read this excerpt, which is kind of at the heart of the matter. The judge told the jury, saying, Having premised these things, I shall observe to you the several questions that arise in this case, and point out to you the manner in which I think they may be best considered and determined. The principal questions are these: whether the 5 persons said to be murdered were in fact killed, and if so, whether they or either of them were killed by the prisoners, or either of them, and if they were, then whether such killing was justifiable, excusable, or felonious, and if the latter, whether it was manslaughter or murder. So this should be familiar enough to most of us today. It's not that different. The judge is telling him, you need to determine if these guys were killed by the soldiers. If they were, was it a matter of murder or was it manslaughter? And it came down to how much the soldiers and Captain Preston feared for their lives. Did they feel they were in danger enough that they had to fire or take some action, or were they just killing people randomly? In the end, the jury did acquit Captain Preston, and he was free to leave. I'm sure he was glad to be out of there. Interestingly, the same day that Captain Preston's trial began, the soldiers petitioned the court to see if they could have a unified trial and be tried together. Their reasoning may have been that it was certain somebody's head was going to roll for this whole thing. They probably felt that if Captain Preston was acquitted, now it would be on them, and that the jury would certainly want to get one of them, especially if they were tried individually. Whoever was last would probably be most likely to get hit or found guilty, just because they had to have someone to sacrifice at the altar of this thing. The trial of the soldiers was very much like Preston's. The judges and jury that were selected were mostly in their favor. In his closing argument to the jury, John Adams made this famous statement. You still hear it today sometimes said. He said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." After deliberation, the jury found 2 of the soldiers guilty of manslaughter, and the punishment was they had a large letter M branded on their thumbs. This was on December 14th, which would have been painful, but better than being hanged or found guilty. So even though the trials were over, Samuel Adams began to hammer away at the soldiers and what had been done in editorials in the newspapers. I think he'd wanted heads to roll more than they did. I think it was a very difficult situation. Some of the judges endured threats to their lives, and had any of them been convicted, I'm not sure what Governor Hutchinson would have done. To have any of these soldiers actually hanged for this would have been a disgrace to him, probably, and he would have seen it as a very embarrassing episode during his administration as governor. The trials, if nothing else, show absolutely how political the legal process, the judicial process, can be at times. That was true back then as it is today. Every year after the massacre, Patriot leaders held a commemoration in March of the Boston Massacre. This was a good way to keep resent building and continuing against British authority. The commemorations all pretty much followed the same course. Bells would be rung, which would summon the people to the Old South Meeting House Church, where they would hear a stirring address by one of the Patriot leaders. In 1771, the very first commemoration occurred, and James Lovell was the speaker that stirred the audience that night. His speech, like all the ones that followed him and every year after that, were somewhat edgy and even pushed the bounds of sedition a little bit. Lovell told the audience, "You see the danger of a standing army to the cause of freedom. If the British Parliament consents from year to year to be exposed, it doubtless has good reasons. But when did our Assembly pass an act to hazard all the property, the liberty, and lives of their constituents? What check have we upon a British army? Can we disband it? Can we stop its pay? Make the bloody 5th of March the era of the resurrection of your birthrights, which have been murdered by the very strength that nursed them in their infancy. Let us once more look into the early history of this province. We find that our English ancestors, disgusted in their native country at a legislation which they saw was sacrificing all their rights, left its jurisdiction and sought like wandering birds of passage some happier climate. Here at length they settled down. The King of England was said to be the royal landlord of this territory. With him they entered into mutual sacred compact by which the prick of tenure and the rules of management were fairly started. It is in this compact that we find our only true legislative authority." One of the other interesting things that happened at these commemorations is crowds of people would go to Paul Revere's house to look at a display he did in his windows. Paul Revere had cut out cutouts, put them on his windows, and then backlit them with candles, kind of like you might see in some of the modern Halloween decorations, to form silhouettes that had to do with this Boston Massacre. On the screen you can see what I've made. I've come up with kind of my own diagram of Paul Revere's house. I know what it looks like. It's still there today. I don't know how these silhouettes looked. I don't know which windows they were in either. We know they were in 3 windows. I assume it was the upstairs windows because they would be more visible to more people. I'm not sure what they look like, so what you're seeing is my own interpretation of how they looked. In one of the windows, I've put it at the right, there was a image of America as represented by a woman in a robe and wearing a liberty cap. We've talked about the liberty cap in past podcasts. And she has her foot on a British grenadier. And she's pointing at the next window, which shows scenes from the Boston Massacre, people being killed, and there's pools of blood. And in the last window, which I put on the left, is the ghost of Christopher Sider, who was being mourned by his friends. He was a young man who was killed in a scuffle with a Tory leader sometime before the events of the Boston Massacre. So how do we assess the Boston Massacre? Was it really a massacre? I don't think it was. I see it more as a terrible tragedy that happened during a violent riot. Some historians have been critical of how violent and resistant the colonists were, but we have to offset this by remembering that taxes had been imposed on the colonists without their consent, and troops had been stationed in Boston without their consent to enforce these taxes, and there was no legal mechanism to address these grievances. Violence and resistance were the only things left to bring about the needed changes. That's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Remember to click the like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you again soon. For further reading on this topic, I recommend all of the books and articles that I've used in my last 3 podcasts, and the following. A True Republican, The Life of Paul Revere by Jane E. Triber. Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero, by Christian D. Spigna. The Boston Massacre, A History with Documents by Neil L. York. The First American, The Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin by H. W. Brands. Cradle of Violence, How Boston's Waterfront Mobs Ignited the American Revolution by Russell Bourne. Samuel Adams, Pioneer in Propaganda by John C. Miller. The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams by Stacy Schiff. And lastly, I recommend the following website, boston1775.blogspot.com.